Breath of the Wild sequel left us with tons of questions, but we have so little to go off of, and so many unanswered questions. All we can do is speculate with this short trailer, but we can also look back to Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild was missing a bunch of key elements other Zelda titles have, such as proper dungeons, real dungeon items like the hookshot, the Triforce of Courage, and most importantly, the 7 Sages. They were not needed in this game to seal Ganon. The only one who did that was Zelda. But in Ocarina of Time, Zelda was one of the 7 Sages who sealed Ganon long ago. But it seems all Zelda did was just get rid of the Calamity, but obviously didn't get rid of the real Ganon. Maybe in the sequel we will again team up to awaken the 7 Sages. Now, even though they were completely absent, that doesn't mean they aren't there. We see 7 statues by the Gerudo region that depicts the 7 Sages as women, with a separate 8th statue far away from the rest. But we also see more statues of the sages in the Yiga hideout. But there are 8 statues again. In Ocarina of Time, Link is tasked to awaken all the 6 sages. Then after all of that is done, Zelda reveals she's the 7th one. But in Link Between Worlds, Zelda is not a sage, and there are 7 sages in Link Between Worlds. And in Wind Waker, it depicts 6 sages, and in Twilight Princess, still 6 sages. The original 6 were Rauru, Saria, Darunia, Ruto, Impa, and Naburu, respectively. In Link Between Worlds, the 7 sages are Gully, Impa, Irene, Auron, Asfala, Rosso, and Ceres. I could go on, but those are the most memorable. Wind Waker, however, has 2, Makar and Medley, Arito and Korok. With evidence we've seen in past games, it's only safe to assume who could possibly be the new 7 sages. However, Zelda has sealing abilities as seen at the end of Breath of the Wild, so she could reprise the role of a sage once again. But what about the other 6 sages? Well, after playing Breath of the Wild again on my channel, which you should check out by the way. But anyway, I think I know the possible new sages of Breath of the Wild sequel. Now, keep in mind this is all speculation, so take it with a grain of salt. But throughout the game we meet several individuals who could possibly fill the role of new sages. I'm going to stick to the original 6 since they are the first ones in the timeline. So with the 7, we could automatically assume Zelda is one of the 7, since she has sealing abilities. Now there are 6 left, and assuming each descendant, I will try to connect them to the corresponding element. So let's get something straight. Impa is alive in Breath of the Wild, but she's really old. But she was old in Link Between Worlds. But I don't think she will be the Sage of Shadow. It would probably most likely be Paya, since she's younger and is Impa's descendant. So it would make an awful lot of sense if it was her, since she is part of the younger generation of sages. Granted though, age probably doesn't matter, since Impa was old in Link Between Worlds, and still the Sage of Shadow, and Gully was just a child, and he was the Sage of Forest. So it could be either Impa or Paya, but I'm gonna go with Paya just to stick with the same theme. Even though most Zelda titles stick to the same respective elements, which are usually Force, Fire, Water, Shadow, Light, and Spirit. However, in Wind Waker, there are only 2 sages we awaken, and they have their own elements, Wind and Earth. So adding these 2 to the original 6 makes 8, obviously, which could explain the 8 statues, but that still wouldn't make sense, however. Zelda games aren't always consistent, which is good and a bad thing at times, so maybe it might change some things around. Maybe Zelda will be a sage, or maybe not, since she isn't always like that. In Wind Waker, the Sage of Earth is a Zora named Laruto, even though she is a Zora in a flooded world. And her descendant is Medley, Arito. You know, the bird people. Also in the Wind Waker, the Wind Sage is a Kokiri named Fado, whose descendant is Makar, the Korok. Both of them being from the forest, and both are the Wind Sage. It would make more sense if, I don't know, the bird girl was the Sage of Wind and the plant boy was the Sage of Earth. That would make more sense, but not every Zelda game is the same, so things change. And also there are 3 separate timelines, so it's bound to be different. So maybe the 7 stages of Breath of the Wild 2 will be different, and maybe we'll change up some stuff, like the sages' respective elements. Now, going back to who I thought would be the new 6 or 7 sages, gonna be the first obvious choices. Paya would be the Sage of Shadow, maybe Impa will be too weak or will get killed by Ganondorf early on, like he did to the sages in Wind Waker. Yunobo would be the Sage of Fire, since he's Daruk's descendant, so he's probably Darunia's descendant as well. So I think it's safe to assume he'd be the Sage of Fire. Sidon would be the Sage of Water, no doubt about it. Riju would be the Sage of Spirit. All of these guys would be obvious choices to be the new sages, given the race they are. and what element they correspond with. Now, that leaves 2 sages left, Light and Forest. The Sage of Light could possibly be Zelda, since she was part of the original 7, but she didn't have an element, just the Triforce. And Maru is Kebora Gebora in another form, so unless someone else will be the new Sage of Light, and I'm just gonna stick with Zelda. The next sage is the Sage of Forest, and the only forest dweller that actually captures our attention and helps us a lot, except for the gold poop. It's Hestu. I mean, sure, Makar was the Sage of Wind and Korok's a Kokiri, just transformed, and the Sage of Forest was the Kokiri Saria. I mean, yeah, I get it, why Makar was the Sage of Wind, since the Korok leaf makes the Koroks fly and produces gust of wind, but come on. They're from the forest, and also Hestu is too big to fly, plus he does have instruments, which are maracas, so it's not out of the question he'd be the Sage of Forest. But even with that, there are still only 6 sages, counting Zelda as the Sage of Light. But what about the last sage, and the 7th element? Since you already said all 6, well, I'm getting there. Now granted, we probably won't find all of these sages in the order I put them in, so that being said, the last element and sage I think would be the Sage of Wind, Tiba. I know the Sage of Wind was Fado and Makar, a Kokiri and Korok, and Medley Arito was the Sage of Earth, so either Nintendo just doesn't want to include those 2, this is just a theory, but it would make an awful lot of sense to have a Wind Sage and have it be Tiba, the Rito, and descendant of Rivali. We are not certain if he is a descendant to Medley, but he is important to the game, and important characters like that in Zelda games usually end up being sages. I'm sure Breath of the Wild does have a bunch of important characters, but none are as memorable as these several characters, so they could be the possible 7 sages of Breath of the Wild sequel. I really hope the sages make a return, and it's these characters, otherwise this theory would be all wrong. And it probably is, but again, it's just a theory, and it's all speculation, so take it with a grain of salt. But who knows? I mean, maybe, if you guys like this and you want to see more, check out my Breath of the Wild Let's Play. I can assure you it won't disappoint. Or you could check out some other theories of mine. But you should also check out my friends' channels too. Bye!